I'm sure you have taken road trips like everybody else, going to faraway places in an RV or a car. Did you know that people do the same thing in an airplane? And just like we have rest areas and faraway destinations in a road trip, there are rest areas and stops along the way in airplanes. In a previous episode, we talked about 5,000 odd airports, public use airports just in the US alone, and we can take full advantage of it.
We'll talk about our experiences and share stories. And with summer coming, you might just want to look up and see those airplanes flying across the country. We call those road trips in the sky. Join us on this next episode.
This is aviation, intrigue.
So, in the world of big airports and airlines, you're always talking to somebody. You're talking to air traffic controller, you're talking to other airplanes. Is that the same thing everywhere?
That's going to be the same thing for the majority of us who travel by air on commercial airliners. There's always going to be constant radio frequencies tuned up. You have to get permission from ground control to taxi. You have to get permission from the control tower to take off and land. And then air traffic control centers are what direct aircraft around when you're flying on an airliner. And by the way, they have a radar as well to keep an eye on all the air traffic out there. So it is busy, it is very talkative, and that's something that we don't normally see from it or hear from a passenger cabin, but that is going on in the background on a constant basis.
So, I can vouch to that. Even when we fly in our personal airplanes, just like airlines, we're always talking to somebody. And in fact, in the previous episode, I talked about exactly this and where that helped me in a few sticky situations because I am talking to controllers.
Yeah, the cool thing about flying is that air traffic controllers are always there and are always available, especially when you've got an urgent situation like we talked about in the last episode. And in the background, they are monitoring all those places at the busier airports. And by the way, you and I have flown into some of these big airports. I think the biggest one I have been to was Midway, where Southwest dominates and 737s are everywhere, but they do let light 2 and 4 seat aircraft in there, but you're talking to the same air traffic controllers as the airliners are, which is pretty cool to think.
Yeah, that is. And I have flown into a few big airports. I've flown into Newark International in
Oh,
New
wow.
Jersey. I've flown into Cleveland. I have flown into Minneapolis, St. Paul International, in a Cirrus. And you're right. We are talking, and it's really cool that you are in a small 4 seat airplane, but you're talking to the same controllers that the United Airlines and the Lufthansa are talking to.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And the challenge to that is not only are you flying, maneuvering your airplane on the ground or in the air, but you are keying up that mic, constantly replying to instructions, constantly listening for instructions. And by the way, you hear everybody else on that same frequency, which helps to give you an idea of what's going on. But let's say you've got to say something. You may have to, quote unquote, wait in line on the radio to say, hey, I'm ready for my clearance to taxi. And that's a big challenge when you're operating something like your 4 seat Cirrus single pilot, where there's no co-pilot to help you out, and that's you operating the aircraft and talking on the radio with all the same people that these big airliners are talking about.
So these big airports have radar, and not only they're talking to you by radio, but on their scope, they show all these blips, each blip corresponding to an airplane, whether it's a big 777 or a small Cessna 152. You show us blips, and that's how they navigate, or that's how they manage all the airplanes in the air.
Yeah, that's one part of air traffic control that's really cool because not only are they talking to you and you have to talk back to them, so you're in communication verbally, but they're also watching every aircraft that's under their airspace or under their control on radar. So you know about those big control towers you see at the big airport? Nearby
Yep.
there or on top of the tower sometimes, or you might see multiple arrays of this. If you see those spinning radar dishes, they're pretty cool to watch actually, because they're always moving around. Those are radar scopes, and they're picking up, scanning for air traffic that that particular facility is responsible for. And we talked in a previous episode about plane spotting online. You can see a lot of that same activity online.
I think that reminds me for people who are watching and listening to us, maybe they can go to the comments and talk about when they have seen these traffic towers, the air traffic towers or radar facilities through the country. That'll be a good thing for us to see.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. When we were discussing about how many hundreds and thousands of airplanes are in the air at once, so that gives you an idea of what air traffic control is looking at. But what
So,
a lot of people don't know is that you don't always have to be on radar or radio contact with air traffic control to get from airport to airport, and we'll talk about that in the next segment.
okay, so keep that aside for a second. So let's say you're doing this road trip in the sky. That's what we talked about earlier. And let's say you're going from airport A to another airport, let's say 500 miles away or 1,000 miles away. What happens? I mean, who are you talking to?
Well, it depends. So sometimes you can go all the way from your starting point to your destination with the radar control, kind of watching you and the other traffic around you, and with constant radio contact. So when a control tower clears you for takeoff, after a few miles, they're going to say, okay, tune this in for your departure control. And they will give you another frequency to switch to talk to the next air traffic controller that's responsible for that next pocket of airspace that you're going to be flying through. And that's called a handoff on the radio. And that handoff is going to occur. Oh, it depends. Every 50 to 100 to 200 miles sometimes. As you go across country, you're going to be asked to switch to the next controller's frequency because they have airspace now that you'll be flying through, and they will generally have radar contact and radio contact with you.
So that to me sounds like, let's say I'm in my car doing a road trip in a car. So I tune to my local station and then I travel 50 miles away. My station starts to fade away. I start to hear all the static. I can't hear them anymore. But then I'm closer to the next town and I could find the frequency of a radio station there and pick it up. So that's kind of what you're talking about, that you're going from one air traffic control station to another as you progress through your trip.
Yeah, that's a great analogy because radio reception works a lot the same way, and you can only go so far before you start losing contact or you start losing that radio quality with the transmissions between you and air traffic control. And by the way, they are all over the country in different facilities on the ground, and those tall control towers we talked about at the big airports, they only handle that terminal area around the airports. So air traffic control centers in between those airports we talked about when you're flying along and getting those handoffs are actually facilities that are scattered all over the country, and you may not even know they're there. They're not even located at airports sometimes, but they have those ground-based facilities for radar and radio to potentially lead any aircraft across the country. And these days, with the modern equipment, we've got pretty good radio and radar coverage because of that.
So let me understand that. So let's say you're leaving an airport,
Mm-hmm.
you're talking to the controllers in that airport, most likely, or somewhere in the vicinity of that airport. And then as you fly, it's possible for you to be far away from another airport that has a control tower or a local traffic controller, and there is a frequency or a controller in between that is kind of coordinating between these two airports. Is that the right way to think about it?
Definitely. It's almost like you're following a chain depending on your flight path, as far as, okay, once you start getting far enough away from an airspace, obviously they do this ahead of time, say, hey, now you'll be contacting this facility. And as you proceed, those handoffs will come and go. And by the time you fly, let's say across the country, we'll talk about that later in the episode, you will have had many, many frequencies that were handed off to if you were to go travel that way.
Okay, so if you're leaving in a small airplane, like the ones we fly, we know who we are talking to, and then they tell us what the person we need to talk to next is and what their frequency is, and we dial those in, and then we can talk to them, and then they will give us the next one, and so on and so forth.
Yes, and because we don't always know, we don't have a list of all the frequencies we may be traveling to. We'll have our route of flight, but we may not always know what's exactly the frequency we're going to be talking over Omaha, Nebraska, for example. They do provide those to you, and that's part of the verbal handoff from place to place as you go. And that is something that keeps you in constant contact. And like we talked about, the airliners being in busy places, constantly talking, and you can hear everybody else. It works the same way in the air. When you're on a frequency flying over an area and there are other aircraft talking to that same controller, you're going to hear all of that in the background as far as monitoring, listening, and listening to the controllers talk to other aircraft. And it's kind of fun. I actually like to hear the chatter when I'm on a long cross country, because it gives you an idea of just who's out there, who's flying at what altitude. So that's kind of a fun way of plane spotting by radio for me.
Right, but in busy airports or busy airspaces, we got to be up on our toes because they are talking to all, let's say there are hundreds of airplanes in the air. The air traffic controllers are talking to these hundreds of airplanes. And then that one call for you, they tell you, Cessna, blah, blah, blah. I want you to climb to 4,000 feet. You need to be immediately pick that up among the hundreds of transmissions. So it's to me, it sounds like, if you're ever sitting in a hospital and talking to a doctor and the doctor is talking to you and suddenly up in the page comes in, paging doctor, blah, blah, blah. And immediately their ears perk up and somehow they tune to it. They don't miss it. It's a similar thing for us as pilots.
Oh, sure. We get asked a lot about, well, how do they know they're talking to you? Sure. The registration number of your aircraft, commonly known as a tail number, is the number. Sometimes it's the letter number combination of your airplane, and they're going to identify you that way because that is how they know who you are. And sometimes they know where you're flying because you've filed a flight plan, and they know, okay, this airplane's going here, and they'll get handoffs along the way.
So this combination of radar and radio is what keeps you safe in the air and how you communicate with the air traffic controllers.
Yes, and if you are flying in the clouds that you talked about in previous experiences, and you do this very frequently in the aircraft you fly, that is where that radio and radar contact are mandatory because they are literally guiding you into the airport because you can't see the airport, you're in the clouds or above it, and sometimes you have to descend down through that obscuration, and that's where air traffic control is absolutely mandatory. Everyone who does that, coming in, going through the clouds, has to be in a radar and at least radio contact.
Okay, so you mentioned something about a flight plan. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. A flight plan, again, it's an option. We're hinting at that with using air traffic control services. And whether you're flying visually with contact with the ground, so you can see where you're going that way, or up and down through the clouds on a flight plan, you can tell air traffic control electronically that your airplane, your tail number, would like to fly from point A to point B. And you can file that flight plan online at dedicated websites so that they kind of know, okay, this is how we can work this aircraft into the air traffic system. And if they choose to continue on with this, they can continue using our services to help with traffic advisories, making sure that you're not getting too close to other aircraft. Weather advisories, sometimes they can tell you if there's bad weather up ahead, and all those services that air traffic control provides. And so that is one way of taking advantage of that, and that is filing a flight plan.
Okay, so by the time we are airborne and talking to the controller, they already know where we are going to go and what route we are going to take.
Yes. And that is a great way to fly because it's an insurance policy that, if you ever end up changing your path for some reason or something is going wrong and you have to do something differently, that air traffic controller will know, okay, this airplane was supposed to show up at this airport and we see that they've gone another way or that they've gone missing. That is a great insurance policy for any emergency that air traffic control knows where you were supposed to go. And if you either don't show up there at about the time you're supposed to be there, or you're contacted on the radio because you do have something, they can kind of get a feel for the situation.
So obviously, when you're driving or taking a road trip in your RV, there is no such thing like air traffic controller. But again, to me, that sounds like, let's say I'm taking a trip from Milwaukee, Wisconsin to Houston, Texas, a long way. I'm going to call my cousin in Houston and say, hey, I'm going to leave at around 8 o'clock and I'm going to plan on stopping at this point, and I'm going to take I-81 or whatever. I tell them that way they have something to expect. And then if I don't show up, they're going to call and say, hey, where are you?
Yeah, definitely. That's a lot like filing a flight plan. In fact, we tell pilots, "Hey, go ahead and call whoever's waiting for you at the other airport." That is also just an insurance plan. If you don't show up, that person is going to start calling the authorities, maybe start searching for you. And air traffic control is just another optional bit of insurance you can add on top of that. And it's even better with your phone, right? You can share your location and have people see where you're going, and that is a lot like our radar services. They can actually see your aircraft in real time and where you're headed, and if they're also talking to you on the radio, better yet. So all of those put together are a great way to travel safely.
Okay, so this is not really different
Yeah.
than a road trip.
No, not
You
really. You
tell them
got all
where
the
you
same tools.
Yeah, so you tell them where you're going, you tell them what route you're going to take. They have a way of tracking where you are. You're talking to somebody. If there's weather, if there's obstruction, if there's traffic, whether you see it or somebody tells you, you can change your path. So it's not that different than taking a road trip.
Not that different. And a lot of people travel by air in 2 and 4 seat airplanes this way. And it's a great way to travel because you have those insurance plans in place. And certainly you do have somebody waiting to pick you up at the airport at the end. So if you put all that together, it's a great way to travel when you can do that and when the weather is good.
Yeah, I do that with my wife all the time.
Hmm.
Every single time I say on board, landed, in the Uber, whatever it is, because I want them to know where I am. So it's not that different.
Oh no, and we talked about flightaware.com and other similar websites. I can find where a friend is going. If they're ferrying an aircraft from one state to another, I can say, "Oh, let's see what route they take." I can look them up there by their tail number, by their aircraft number, and track where they're going. And that's really fun because you always know where they are, and it's just fun to watch somebody's progress as they're traveling. So it's just something you can have fun with when you're tracking airplanes online, especially when it's someone you know in a particular airplane going somewhere. And then you can also text them on the way too.
Okay, so that's great. So we just laid out how you could plan these road trips in the air. But now you're going to tell me that you don't have to do this. You can fly under the radar, so to speak. Is that right?
Yes, there you have the option when the weather is good enough for you to be able to navigate on your own to literally fly under the radar because those services only go so low to the ground. And by the way, you don't have to always be talking to air traffic control. There's a whole world out there of airplanes flying around, sometimes with radios, but sometimes that is strictly optional. And we'll talk more about that.
So, Elaine, we talked about in a different episode that 90% of the airports in the US don't have control towers. So, when you say you could fly under the radar, are you referring to these airports where there are no control towers?
Yes, you're absolutely right. 90% is a very good estimate of airports that do not have control towers. So people will ask, well, okay, without air traffic at the airport, how do you not run into each other? And how do you get guided around? And what about permission? Because we talked about getting permission for every move you make. Well, with the airports that don't have control towers, they are assigned one of a handful of radio frequencies, and these are completely different from the air traffic control frequencies because air traffic control does not pay attention to these frequencies. They don't use them. They might be able to look them up for you in an emergency if you need help, but these are just strictly assigned to those airports, and you will have airplanes, pilots talking to each other on those frequencies as they get closer to an airport to announce that they're coming in, what direction they're coming in from, report their position every now and then all the way in so that all the airplanes in that area can figure out how to avoid each other. And by the way, there are protocols at every airport on how to enter into an approach to a given runway. And so, with those protocols and then with the radio frequencies, that's how pilots in light airplanes, especially, manage their own traffic, so to speak.
Got it. That's not that different than if I go skiing with 5 friends. We have walkie
Mm-hmm.
talkies and we say,
Yep.
okay, well, let's all use channel 12. So we all put in channel 12 and we can talk to each other. Nobody else is monitoring. Or if they do, they don't know what we're talking about. Then they say, oh, okay, well, I'm mid mountain, or I'll meet you at the ski lodge or whatever. So it's not that different.
Oh, sure. It's a lot like CB radio. So if you listen to truck drivers talking on the highway, there are certain shared frequencies where anyone can join in on. Either say, okay, where they are, what's going on. It's also great to give each other reports of, hey, watch for that weather up ahead, watch for that road closure, hazards up ahead. There are certainly lots of uses for these frequencies besides just reporting each other's position, so that you know what traffic is in your area. Because the most safety risk with aircraft getting too close are definitely around airports within a few miles. And you mentioned if you're out on an excursion or skiing, people do this hunting where they carry walkie talkies. There are other frequencies where you don't have to make that airport frequency busy with all the extra talking, so that you're not interfering with critical flight information or aircraft positions. There are little special frequencies, there are a few of them around, where you can just chat with other people. I believe in truck driving world, it's called channel 19, and you'll say breaker 19. I'd like to join in on the conversation and have a very informal chat that way. So there are radio frequencies even for flying around like that. You can use along with the ones that are assigned to the airport. So there's a lot of radio frequencies out there that people may not realize that are in use in a lot of these light airplanes.
So, Elaine, let's go back to this whole road trip in the sky. So, here's the scenario. I'm leaving from an airport, one of these 90% of the airport without a control tower. And let's say I'm going to a place 300 miles away with another airport without a control tower. Who am I talking to? What are my obligations?
Sure. The short answer is you don't have to talk to anyone, and you are probably not on anyone's radar. So we talked about the light airplanes generally flying somewhere between 1,000 feet above the ground to 3,000 or 4,000 feet above the ground. And that's a very common altitude window where you do not have to talk to anybody, and you may not be on radar, and who cares? So you have to get around by yourself visually. We talked about at the airports, once you're getting closer, you may want to report your position because that's where you're more likely to encounter another airplane. But in between, you don't have to talk to anybody.
So if I can navigate myself, in other words, if I know where I'm going, if I'm not in any controlled airspace that I'm supposed to talk to somebody, and I can visually see and fly myself, then I could fly this 300 miles without ever talking to anybody or being on somebody's radar.
Yes, absolutely. It's very, very common for airplanes to either just listen to the radio and not say anything or not talk to anybody. And you can fly hundreds of miles, actually more. I found this out without really dealing with any air traffic control required airspace, without having to be seen on radar, without having to talk to too many other aircraft. And that is absolutely one way of flying. And you navigate yourself using maps of airports and landmarks around to get yourself around visually. And most of us, even the small airplanes, by now have GPS, and that makes navigating on your own a lot easier.
So I have to tell you that this is a completely different world, even for me. This is not something I do. I've never flown anywhere without talking to somebody. So I'm learning a lot from what you're saying. I'm used to the world of you're always talking to somebody, you're always on the radar. So this is fascinating to me, but I can totally understand. So if as long as I'm flying somewhere without having to talk to somebody, and I can see where I'm going and I can navigate, I'm good. I can go. It's like you getting on your RV or your car and you're driving. You don't have to talk to anybody. You don't have to tell anybody.
Yes, it's amazing how people don't realize it can be very much like the same thing. Like, I just want to prepare a little flight. I want to go sightseeing. Maybe I want to take a friend along and show them what it's like to sightsee from a small aircraft. We're going to get in the airplane, no control tower, take off from that little airport. Maybe you do use a radio if you want to, just as an insurance policy, because it is good practice, but you are not required to do that. In those little airspaces that are not under control, you don't even have to have a radio legally. And so you could take off, fly around wherever you want, as long as you know, as pilots we're trained on, places we need to stay away from, and the big busy airports and all that. But you can fly around a scenic area, show your friend the sights, fly around low and slow, and go where you're supposed to go, but you're basically navigating yourself. You don't have to ask for permission to fly over many, many, many miles in the countryside, outside of busy airports and outside of big cities. And then you can land at another airport if you want. You don't have to talk to anybody if there's no control tower. And you can take off anytime you want and go to the next airport or go back home on your own time.
Well, like I said, that's fascinating to me. And I'm sure that's of interest to a lot of people. I bet a lot of you who are listening and watching, you probably don't know or did not know that you could fly for thousands of miles without talking to anybody. So in the comments, let us know if you were surprised or not. I certainly was. But Elaine, you said something that caught my attention. You said you could even fly without a radio. So let's get into it in the next segment. Elaine, so you talked about the potential that you could fly and not even have a radio. So I'm just curious, why are there no radios?
So it's for one thing, it's actually not legally required. When we talked about flying around a lot of airspace that exists in the country, especially when you're at the lower altitudes, where you do not have to have a radio. And that is something that's a little less common these days because there are more airplanes out there flying around. The equipment for radios are very, very good and inexpensive. So you will have mostly radio equipped aircraft. But the fact that you don't have to have any of that really surprises people. And if you want to take that a step further, there's a worldwide community of historic airplane restorers and pilots. They will rebuild something like, have you ever heard of the Sopwith Camel in the Snoopy cartoons? Here's the World War I flying ace flying the Sopwith Camel. That is a historic First World War airplane. And that's one example of many that people have rebuilt because they are history buffs and want to relive history and have something really, really cool to fly and to show people. And there are contests where they show off how well they've restored these airplanes. And of course, they never came with radios in the original versions. So sometimes they will say, okay, I have a vintage airplane from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s that were never built with radios. And some pilots may choose, okay, I would like to have that authenticity, and I don't want to put a radio in because I don't have to have one, and I'd like to fly around like that. A lot of people do put in little handheld like walkie-talkies so that they can at least listen to air traffic coming into a non-towered airport and maybe talk to another pilot if they need to, because that's a good safety tool. But since it's not required and some people enjoy flying like that, it could be a really cool experience to fly a few hundred miles on a low and slow airplane without talking to anyone, just enjoying the scenery, enjoying the wind, enjoying that fairly quiet small engine as you're just enjoying the views. And that can be one type of flying experience that some people really seek out.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure this is surprising to most people who are listening, that the regulations do not require you to have radio. And as long as you're not in one of these controlled airspace or airport, you could fly without a radio. And I assume this even includes some of these historic airplanes you mentioned, that they don't even have a battery or another way of generating power. So there's no way to power the radio. They were minimalistic airplanes made of fabric and wood and stuff like that.
Oh, that's a great point. A lot of those very old airplanes, even when restored, they were built just the way as when they were originally made, without an electrical system. So you were probably starting it up by hand, propping the prop to get it going, and you had no electrical, so no lights, no radio, and that's where that optional walkie-talkie style portable radio might be an option. And what's really funny is that you might have Cub pilots, Camel pilots, Tiger Moth pilots, all these vintage airplanes, probably flying with maybe a little portable radio if they felt they needed it, or maybe a little portable GPS, but they will not allow that to be installed in their airplane because they very much want to have that authentic historic airplane.
Yeah, I can totally understand people who are into vintage stuff. I'm not. I'm a modern avionics kind of guy. I do fly gliders with minimal avionics, but most of the airplanes I fly have very modern avionics. So I'm kind of spoiled or maybe don't know what I'm missing. But I totally understand people who are into vintage. They want that authentic World War II type look. And I completely get it. It's just surprising that that's okay from a legal standpoint.
Yes, and you'll get into newer aircraft that were built with radios, and a lot of those, let's say 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, may have just come with one radio. And again, not legally required, but the airplane came with one. And so that became much more of an option. And by now, the newer airplanes, like the Cirrus that you and I fly, that's an example of a light four-seat airplane that comes with two radios, a couple of GPS units, and has all the equipment. So you can see the spectrum can be from nothing to a little bit of something to full blown radio and GPS equipment. And you mentioned flying that type of aircraft. That's one that can go places. And you've been to a lot of busy airports where you're definitely using all that equipment. So it's really fun to see that spectrum there. That people will be surprised that you could go from nothing to a lot. And speaking of which, it's perfectly legal even with a radio equipped airplane to not use it.
So this is let me understand this thing. So just because you have one of these historic airplanes without a radio or without a power generating alternator, battery, whatever, you could even take long distance trips. So back to our road trip, you could take these road trips across the country or halfway across the country. And as long as you pick your routes properly and you have fair weather and you are at the proper altitude, you could fly without a radio.
Yes, you can. As long as you've got that map, that sometimes a GPS to help out. But remember that way back when those airplanes were built, they had paper maps that they carried to get around to find their way from airport to airport, perhaps even following a road to an airport, flying from town to town, because that's most likely where you'll find airports. And there are people who fly around like that just for fun and travel to see the country. There are some great memoirs written from people who happen to be light airplane pilots who have said, okay, I need to take this trip across the country by myself in a two-seat airplane, and I'm not going to be talking to anybody most of the time. And the fact that they did that is basically just like anyone who wants to get into the camper or hop on their motorcycle and say, okay, I'm just going to spend the next few days driving around at my own pace, enjoying the views and enjoying the solitude and just enjoying the ride. And that is basically something you can do anytime you want in a small airplane.
That's interesting. Totally not for me. That's not me at all. But you mentioned a few memoirs. Let's go ahead and put those in the description notes so people can take a look at those memoirs, or maybe they can get it downloaded or buy it and read it for themselves. Elaine, have you flown these airplanes without radio or with limited equipment from, let's say, a longer distance?
Yes, a couple of times. Usually it's just a local flight. I'll do something, and there are historic airplanes that originally did not come with radios, like the Piper Cub. The Yellow Cub is a more famous example where you can take off at a small airport, like we talked about, go to another small airport, and in between, you really don't have to talk or listen to anything if you don't want to. One time I ferried an aircraft of that type of make and model. It was a small two-seat red and black airplane. Had a beautiful new paint job on it, and it had a little radio that was kind of fuzzy. It was kind of an old little portable radio, and somebody needed to get it from the Midwest down to Texas, and it was one of those really cool flights where I'm flying over the Ozarks on the way to Texas and not talking to anybody, not really listening. It was just quiet out there. There weren't any airplanes, and just enjoying the scenery. And that was a pretty cool experience because I had never flown over the Ozark Mountains before, and the weather was just gorgeous. And I remember thinking for that 3 hours it took me to cross over there through Arkansas that, oh, this is really cool. Just looking around and enjoying the ride. And it's surprising how many people just like to road trip that way in a small airplane. And summer's a great time to do that. That's usually when you'll see that happening.
I've done a lot of these long distance flying, but always in more better equipped airplanes. So it's very interesting. I can totally understand the charm. Like I said, it's not for me, but I can totally understand the charm. So when you're doing this without a radio or with minimal radio or a pocket radio that can only pick up certain, limited geography, is that scary or is it liberating?
I think some people might find that scary, especially if you're used to having not just one radio, but a lot of people are only comfortable with two radios because if one fails, at least you have the backup. It's something that if you had experience with doing, or let's say you started flying that way, that's how I started flying at small, tiny country airport where a lot of people just didn't talk on the radio, or they had old airplanes that were really fun to fly, but didn't come with radios. And so, if that's what you're exposed to early in your flying, as I was, you consider that normal. And I flew for a long time after I got certificated without doing too much on the radio. You would sometimes talk to another pilot coming into the local airport, but that was it otherwise. And it was up to you to just watch where you were going, and that was just normal. And then when you get into more sophisticated airplanes and teaching people how to fly these airplanes, you get very, very used to having those extra layers of radio communication. We talked about radar, where if you're flying high into busier places, you'll even be on radar. And so those are all the tools that are available. But I kind of like the variety where you can go with nothing, low and slow, in a small airplane with the window open and enjoying the ride, or giving someone their first airplane ride, which is a great way to experience that, and not talking to anybody. To the opposite, it's also fun to go to a big airport, but that is the spectrum that you can enjoy depending on what your mission is.
Yeah, fascinating world of aviation. I'm a guy who likes these airplanes with two radios. And if even when I'm talking to air traffic controller en route, and let's say for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, it got really quiet, I'm the guy who's going to key up the mic and say, hey, is anybody out there? Or is my radio still working? I get nervous.
Yeah,
But I guess you're on this side or that side, but I appreciate that you kind of you're comfortable with the no radio or radio but without using it, or talking full-fledged to air traffic control. So that's pretty interesting. So I assume that you like this flight over Ozarks.
Yeah, that was a very, very memorable flight. I think it was the first time I'd gone that distance in an airplane that small and that basically equipped, and so that was quite the experience. I don't think I would have done that if I hadn't just had years of experience flying with little to no radio and in aircraft that can only go so high. So that was pretty cool, and I think I'd like to maybe do some more of that when you have good weather day and you have an aircraft that you can take across. In fact, I looked up a trip just for my own research, to just prove to people who maybe are surprised to hear about this no radio concept. I mapped out on my aviation map a route that you can almost go straight line without too much zigzagging at all, from the very tip of Northeast Maine, so a town called Lincoln, Maine, all the way across to Washington State. So I found a little town on the very far tip called Linden, Washington. I thought, Lincoln to Linden, I'm going to put that on my bucket list and say, well, you could fly anything you like across the country that way with a well-equipped radio and radar, or you can fly without a radio all that way across the country. And I think a lot of people would be surprised to hear that you can do that, that people have done that, and that people are out there doing that today. So whatever distance you choose, that's available to you. That's a great way to enjoy one aspect of flying.
Well, when you're doing that trip, I want to go with you from Lincoln, Maine to Linden, Washington, in a plane that has limited capability and potentially not talking to anybody.
Yeah, yeah. The fact that you can just do that literally without a radio, and not only is that perfectly legal, a lot of people have done trips like that. And I'm thinking, I'm going to keep that route just to see if I could maybe fly parts of it someday and check that out. But just to prove a point, I wanted to go from tip to tip across the country and show that you could do that without really going too far out of your way. There are the
Yeah.
Rockies to cross, but that's another matter. There are ways to get a small airplane across the mountains without having to go too high through some passes, and so that's one of the questions you'll get on that. But it is truly possible.
Yeah, I'd love to go. I'm not going to do this trip by myself, but if you're going, I'm going with you. So make sure you
Absolutely.
get a two-seat plane. I'm a guy who puts a GPS to go from my grocery store to home. So I'm just the opposite side of the
I
spectrum.
would probably want GPS for that trip just to make sure, because that's available. But you definitely can fly just about all of it without saying a word, which is pretty cool. Yeah, definitely take a ride in a Cub to start out, and if you like it, you could go across the country with it.
So this is great. Circling back, just like you do a road trip in an RV, in your car, in your camper. You could do the same thing in an airplane. You could fly everything without a radio with limited capabilities airplane, or with some minimal capabilities but not talking to any air traffic controller, as long as you pick the proper route and proper weather, or talking to air traffic controller in radar system. So the entire spectrum, entire continuum you can fly. That's what makes today's aviation so fascinating.
Yep, that is really great. And with summer coming up, there are going to be a lot of people planning their camping trips with their airplanes, which is really cool. You can go to any airport you like, whether it has a control tower or not, depending on what you choose. And a lot of those non towered airports, you can literally pitch a tent by your airplane and sleep under the wing and treat your airplane like your camper. People do this all the time when the weather is good, and it's amazing. I think it's amazing what you can come across and the people you can meet doing that way. Just like when you're taking your camper across the country, you see interesting things and you meet interesting people. And that's the same way with that kind of air travel.
We'd love to hear from people who are watching and listening, your camping trips and your cross country trips, and the most interesting one. Let us know in the comments. And Elaine, you have convinced me that we have to do follow-up episodes of doing these kind of cross country trips that are interesting and share with our audience.
Yeah, we've got some exciting things for the summer flying season coming up, and I hope we can talk about those in a future episode.